Hi, welcome to episode 346 of COVID Calls. It's a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse set of folks who are disaster experts and other experts around the world. My name is KRISTIN UrquIZA, and I am guest hosting for the day. For those of you who do not know me, I am the co-founder and co-executive director of Marked by COVID. It's a national grassroots-powered nonprofit. We promote accountability, recognition, justice, and a pandemic-free future by elevating truth and science. And it was founded just days after I lost my Mexican-American father, Mark Anthony, to the virus last June 30th of 2020. And I'm coming to you live from San Francisco, California. And I'm very excited for this discussion today. I will be bringing on a set of parents and educators who have really been on the front line of this pandemic when it comes to both their own families and the families of communities around them. They also have all lost a partner in this pandemic. So joining me today will be Pamela Addison, Jerry Vance, and Ebony James. So in addition to managing the grief of losing a loved one, they are also juggling a host of different issues, whether it's loss of income from their partner, the grief of their children, and just about everything else that goes into parenting now, juggling that solo. So we'll dig into that in just a few moments, but a couple of housekeeping pieces first. As a reminder, you can usually catch COVID Calls live weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. We have a YouTube channel, COVID Calls YouTube, and you can also hear COVID Calls anytime recorded on podcasts, such as Spotify or iTunes or wherever you happen to tune in. And please keep in contact with us. You can follow us on Twitter at US of Disaster or at COVID Calls. And if you'd like to keep up with what I'm doing in Marked by COVID, you can follow at Marked by COVID to keep up on our activities as well. And please don't feel free to reach out with any ideas you may have for guests, topics, or discussion points. So today, we are at September 28th, 2021. And looking at the numbers across the world and in the United States, we are still very much in the thick of this pandemic. We are nearing an incredible benchmark of nearly 5 million deaths across the world. We're at 4,761,734 deaths. And here in the United States, we are about to surpass an unimaginable 700,000 lives lost. We are at 692,058 deaths as of today. And that's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. Nearly 700,000 deaths. So today, we are going to spend our time exploring the impact of this virus, specifically on children. Now, taking a step back, we've been speaking a little bit about children here in the US in the context of back to school. And just a few weeks ago, I was guest hosting with a group of educators and others from Arizona who were working to ensure that their back to school season would be safe and that a ban on masking would not impact local schools from deciding whether or not they wanted to institute common sense safety measures. Luckily, just yesterday, a judge ruled that the attempts were unconstitutional. And for now, the people of Arizona can breathe a little deeper, that they can continue working with their school boards and other parents and caretakers and community members to ensure that their kids can go to school safely as we work towards COVID-free schools. Well, with the focus of in-person learning, I think it's been a very right thing to do for COVID advocates to focus on removing barriers towards safe schools. But there are many other issues facing children today. The other issue that comes to mind is vaccination, something that we talk a lot about. When will the vaccines be approved for children under 12? And this has been an issue that's been in the news recently because there was data sent to the FDA on trial information for vaccines for children under the age of 12. And it will still take several weeks to have the FDA analyze that and make recommendations based upon that data. But even with us moving in the right direction on vaccines for children, we're still missing a huge elephant in the room. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is also something that will continue to be an issue as we move forward out of the crisis part of the pandemic into the recovery phase. And that is, what about the children who have lost a parent or a caretaker to this pandemic? According to the Wall Street Journal, who ran a report yesterday, there are more than 1 million children worldwide who have lost a primary caretaker to this pandemic. And here in the United States, we estimate, according to data available by the CDC and interpreted by ABC News, that more than 140,000 children have lost a primary or secondary caretaker to the virus. Earlier this year, it was estimated that nearly 43,000 children had lost a primary caretaker. One of the reasons why these are just estimates is that we're not doing enough to really track the impacts of the virus on children. But what we do know is that many children in the United States have lost a parent. And I think about this on a couple of reasons why we need to care about it. First and foremost, these children are just entering into their lives, and dealing with the grief of a parent has got to be monumental. Doing some digging around what does bereavement look for children, I came across this quote from Maria Collins, who heads up the New York Life Foundation's Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative. She said, "Grief can have a serious impact on learning, academic performance, and can lead to behavioral issues and societal withdrawal." She continues, "It's really important that we understand and acknowledge that these losses exist and figure out how they impact how children learn and how they are presented in the classroom." So grief is one issue that these children are navigating both here and across the world. But there's also other issues that might be directly a little bit more indirect to the child itself, but direct to the environment of the child. And one thing that I think of on this topic is loss of income. And just putting myself kind of in this situation, I've often thought about what would my life be like if this pandemic had happened 25 years ago when I was still a young teenager living at home with my parents. I continue to kind of play that out. My dad was the primary breadwinner. He was actually the only person in our, my immediate family who had a full-time job that was paying. My mother took care of her elderly and sick mother, my grandmother, for nearly 7 years. And while that was a very important job, it wasn't a job that brought in income. And just kind of playing that out further, realizing that, we would have most likely have lost our home. We would have needed to rely on a social safety net or, extended family members to take us in. I wonder if I would have gone to college. I can only imagine that I would have been compelled to instead try and find a position to, help pay the bills as soon as possible to keep, to help care for my aging grandmother, who was part of our nuclear family at that point in time. And while I'm lucky that that didn't happen to me per se, that is happening to literally tens of thousands of children across this country. Their parents are being forced to make impossible decisions while still taking care of their children, managing the complexities of parenting solo, going back to work, and so much more. So I'm going to pause with my introduction of just this issue itself and actually bring on the real experts to talk about this. I'm so lucky to be joined by not only three parents, but three parents who are also in the field of education. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of them and then invite them onto the podcast to connect. So first of all, I'm going to be joined by Pamela Addison. She lost her husband, a healthcare worker, at the very start of the pandemic. And she has two children, ages 3.5 and just 22 months. And a few months after losing her husband, she founded the Facebook group called Young Widows and Widowers of COVID-19. And she became a COVID advocate for young widows and young children. Also joining us is Ebony James, who lost her husband, Terrence James. Both worked in public education, and they have three children who will forever be changed by the loss of their father and her best friend. And last but certainly not least, I have Jerry Vance joining me. Jerry lost her husband, James, on New Year's Day, and she has three children, 22, 12, and 8. 51 days after losing her husband, she also lost her mother-in-law to COVID. She joined up with Pamela in the Young Widows group and decided to turn her pain into advocating for her children and other families living with the devastation of this pandemic. Thank you, each and every one of you, for joining the call today. I would love to hear a little bit more about your stories and then dig into the issues facing both you and other families that you see out there. Pamela, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your story and where you're calling in from.
So I'm calling in from Waldwick, New Jersey. At the beginning of the pandemic, my husband was a speech pathologist in the hospital. So he assessed people's swallowing abilities, and he went into work every day knowing the risks because we were not prepared. He had a fight to get an N95 mask, and around 2 weeks after shutdown, he started with his symptoms, and it just went downhill from there. He spent 26 days in the hospital, so April 3rd was the last day I ever saw my husband as he was being brought down on the stretcher from our bedroom. And he fought hard. And it was very unexpected because 2 hours before he died, the doctor told me that it was going to be better tomorrow. And 2 hours later, I got the phone call that he went into cardiac arrest and was gone. So at the time of his death, I had a 5-month-old and my daughter had just turned 2. And that was also the time on the news, you were just hearing that, oh, if you're young, this is going to be like a really bad flu and you'll recover. So I really had this assumption that I was all alone in this and that no one was ever going to understand what I went through, and kind of asking myself, why am I this young widow? Why him? He was young, he was healthy. I didn't understand it. So, I kind of went through my adjusting in grief. And then a few months later, I still realized that now I was hearing more about young people. And when I wrote a op-ed for NewJersey.com, there were so many young widows commenting on it. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's been like 6 months and people still think they're alone. I need to do something. And that's when I founded Young Widows and Widowers of COVID-19, because I didn't want anyone to ever feel alone like I did.
I understand that. And since the founding of that group, I know that you've connected with folks all across the country who have shared your, experience. I know one of those is Jerry, who is joining us today. Jerry, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and hear about your story, as well as, how you connected up with Pamela.
Well, I'm from Princeton, West Virginia. And I guess, through when the pandemic started and stuff, my husband was a police officer. So we were like extremely cautious. He would come home, change in the garage, come straight in and shower. More so, he was just a very protective father. So he was terrified of bringing something in to his kids. He did retire last June. We were lucky that he was finally like, I'm to the point, I'm going to retire. I want to spend more time with my kids. I've missed out on a lot already because of the way they 12-hour shifts and things. And last December, I don't know, he started with a little cough, and we really didn't think much of it because we had been very careful. And then I got a tickle in my throat and kind of like a sinus infection feeling. And I went and I actually tested positive first. So then I told him, I was like, hey, get the girls ready. We're all going to get tested. And our entire family ended up being positive. All four of us had different symptoms. That was on December the 4th. On December the 7th, he went to our local hospital. We really thought he would get some medicine, get some fluids, come home. He was still breathing okay. I mean, he would cough and lose his breath, but we really thought we were ahead of it. And he called me and told me that they didn't have a bed to admit him at our local hospital, and that they were going to send him to West Virginia University, which is about 3.5 hours away from where I live. And which is fine because it's one of the biggest hospitals in the state. It's a great hospital. So I felt confident that he was going there. They didn't get him there until about midnight. 10 o'clock the next morning, the doctors call and have the conversation with me that they need to make me his power of attorney because they need to put him on a vent. And he was awake, obviously, and having the conversation. And he was like, they say it's better to get ahead of it. And so they put him on the vent on the 8th. That night, the hospital called me back and said, hey, we have to put him on ECMO. We don't have a bed for that. We need to send him to Pittsburgh. So then he ends up 5 hours away, at least between 5 and 6 hours, depending on traffic. So they flew him to Pittsburgh for the ECMO machine. He did great with the ECMO. I mean, some of the nurses and the doctors there, they were calling him strong man. He still was very much physically like a police officer. He had also been a Marine. So he was strong, in decent shape, And the nurses were calling him strong man, and they were all bragging about how great he was doing. He come off of the ECMO in 8 days, which is rather quick for what most people are staying on it. They moved him from the ECMO unit to just the regular COVID ICU. He made progress there every day. They had the vent down to the lowest setting by day 14. But he come off of the vent on day 19, and they told us, they were talking with me about bringing him home and services he would need, physical therapy and occupational therapy and speech therapy. And in my mind, when they started saying all these therapies, I thought they wouldn't be wasting their resources if they truly didn't think he was getting better. Well, our 12-year-old, our middle child, her birthday is on New Year's Eve. So we had set these goals all December. We were hoping we could talk to him before Christmas. And then it was well, at least we hope we can talk to him on Julia's birthday. And we actually did. We got to have a great conversation with him. I'm so thankful for it. He couldn't really talk very much, where his throat was still kind of really messed up from the vent, but he was off the vent. He was alert, and he knew what we were saying, and he could kind of whisper so that we would understand him. And I had to hire a plumber that day. So I was like, James Vance, you better get better because I had to hire a plumber today. It probably did not get fixed the way you would want it fixed. So you need to get better and come home. And he like rolled his eyes at me, and my girls were like, oh, look at daddy. He's getting back to normal, rolling his eye, because we just always picked back and forth and stuff like that. And we went out to eat for my daughter's birthday. We came back probably around 10 o'clock. I called his nurse and I was like, can you just tell him that we're going to watch the ball drop, but we love him, let him know we're thinking about him. And the nurse called me back and was like, I just wanted you to know. I went in and told him, and he had the biggest smile on his face. And he said, I think it really done him good to get to talk to you guys earlier. So, like I went to sleep happy. For the first time in a month, we'd had a normal conversation with him, and they were talking about therapy. So in my mind, he was getting better. He was coming home. And then the next morning, I actually slept probably 8.5 hours that night, which was the most I had slept in one stint the entire time. And I don't know if it was the exhaustion where I actually had COVID, or if it was like peace of mind where I thought he was finally had turned the corner. One of the doctors had actually told me, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, and I don't like to say it, but I'm pretty sure we're out of the woods. So I was just, it was relaxed. And the next morning when I got up and I realized that I had slept until 9 a.m., it caught me off guard. And as soon as I called, everybody kept transferring me around. It was, hold on, like nobody would get his nurse. The nursing staff had gotten to know me by that point, and I would just call and say, hey, this is Jerry Vance. Can I talk to James's nurse for the day? And it was weird. It was like, yeah, hold on. And then somebody else got on the phone and we're like, oh, hold on. Was the nursing supervisor on the phone with you? And then it was, hey, the charge nurse wants to talk to you. But it was like I would be on hold for like 4 or 5 minutes. And in my mind, I knew then, I was like, something is going on and nobody wants to tell me. So I kind of, while I'm on hold, I text one of my best friends and I was like, she's an RN. I said, listen, I need you to find out what's going on. Call, here's his code, see what they'll tell you. I'm getting dressed, I'm going to Pittsburgh. And she was like, no, you don't need to take. I was like, I'm going to Pittsburgh. If I have to stand outside of the hospital, I'm going to Pittsburgh. So she was like, then she immediately went from trying to get me not to go to, well, I'm coming to drive you. Calm down, because she didn't want me going that far. She talks to the nurse. She tells me, hey, he's taking a bad turn. The doctors are going to call you. Are you alone? And I was like, no, I have my kids with me. In that process, I called James's, he might as well be his brother. It's one of the police officers, but they've been best friends since 7th grade. So I called Denny and I'm like, I need a police escort to get me to Pittsburgh. So the West Virginia State Police do an escort to get me to Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, we were only gone about an hour, and they called and asked me if he were to code, would I want them to attempt like CPR and to resuscitate him? And I was like, absolutely. And she said, well, his oxygen is causing us fits right now. They thought he had a blood clot. They couldn't get him stable enough to go to CT. They went ahead and gave the medicine as if he did have a blood clot. And he ended up going into cardiac arrest, they assumed, from the blood clot. And they did CPR for I think it was about 40 minutes. And a doctor called and told me that he was gone. But like I said, it changed. We went from the night before going to bed thinking he's coming home, he's getting better, he's going to beat this. And honestly, before we got COVID, I would have thought I would have done worse with COVID because I had more issues than him. I mean, he was young, he was healthy, he was in way better shape than I am. But in the span of 9 hours, we went from him coming home to he was gone.
Wow.
And it was just, so we didn't make it. We were about halfway to Pittsburgh, which did not help that, I spent a month away from him, that I couldn't be there to advocate for him and to make sure. And I really do feel like he got amazing care. I have talked to a lot of the staff since then, and I do feel like that they cared about him. But at the same time, I couldn't be there to make sure that they were treating him like I would want him treated.
Of course. I understand completely that whole of not being able to be with your loved one while they're in the hospital. I want to bring in Ebony to the conversation. Ebony, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you too lost your partner. Would you like to share with us a little bit of your COVID story and how you connected with the Widowers group?
Yes, most certainly. Thank you for having us on. I came across the Widows group because when it happened, of course, just like Jerry was saying, it was a total shock. I felt completely alone, and I happened to be looking up various articles, and I came across an article with Pamela, and I read her article. I am not a social media person at all, and but when I looked into her group, I was like, wow, this would be a great support group for me, because everyone that I talked to didn't seem to understand. My husband and I both are educators. He got COVID actually from eating lunch with a coworker. I was a little bit shocked, because my husband was extremely conscious and he wore 2 masks. I couldn't believe it. He ended up missing work, and he never liked to miss because he's a teacher and he didn't like anyone else teaching his classes. And so when he missed, I thought to myself, that's odd. So I went to work on that Monday. When I came back home, he just said, oh, I'm feeling a little bit better. I thought everything was fine. And on Tuesday, he said, well, I'm just going to stay and I'm going to rest up a little bit more, so I can be 100%. I said, great idea. I called him Tuesday on my way home from work. He took our son to Taekwondo. I thought everything again was fine because he was out and about. He says, hey, I'm going to get some NyQuil and everything will be fine. I said, okay. On Wednesday, I left before he did. Come to find out, he didn't go to work on Wednesday. I knew something was wrong then. So I told him, I'm going to take you to get you a COVID test. And so I had taken a COVID test at work and mine came back negative. So I thought, nah, you don't have COVID. I don't have it. We're good. But I noticed that he just didn't seem to be getting any better. On that Thursday, because we couldn't find anywhere to get a COVID test that Wednesday. That Thursday, I went ahead and took him in to get a COVID test. He was positive. I immediately went ahead and took him into the hospital because of his breathing seemed to be so labored. I tested positive on that Friday, and I was admitted into the hospital 4 days later because I was not well either. We were literally 5 doors down from each other on the same hallway. However, they would not let us see each other. We had to call each other on the phone to talk to one another. Terrence seemed to be doing much better as time progressed. But his eventually his lungs ended up collapsing, and they did say they wanted to put him in ICU. They put him in ICU. He did seem to make a progression where he was better. By the time he seemed better, I got released from the hospital, even though I was still testing positive for COVID. I still was sick, but of course they didn't see a need for me to be in the hospital. And so they began to wean him off of the oxygen because he was getting oxygen support. They weaned him off of sedation, where the last night before my husband passed, I always ended our calls with love you, love you, love you, Terrence. And he actually responded back by saying, love you too, babe. And I just didn't think anything of it. The next day, I slept in kind of like Jerry. I felt rested because I felt like it was fine. I thought it was better. And I ended up calling and they told me that his oxygen levels were dropping. And I was like, how can that be? I mean, he was almost at 100% last night. What are you talking about? And they said, we'll call you back. And I'm like, call me back? What do you need to call me back about? So I said, well, I tell you what, I said, I called him back again. And I said, if you just let me talk to him, I said, if he hears my voice, I said, it'll be fine. They said, okay, give us some time to get him stable. We'll call you back. No one called me back. I called back again. They finally answered and they said, we're going to set up the Zoom call for you. And I said, okay. I said, how long do I wait? And they said about 30 minutes. So I waited and no one called. So finally someone called me back and said he just had a heart attack. And I was like, what do you mean he just had a heart attack? And they said, we think that he has air on his chest. And they asked me, could they get my approval to put in another tube? I said, absolutely. And they said, well, if he has a cardiac arrest again, we don't know that he will come back. And I said, oh, no. I said, he's a fighter. I said, he's coming back. And I said, y'all just go ahead and put the tube in. I said, call me when you're done. I said, because he'll be fine. It was 30 minutes later, they called me and they let me know that Terrence passed. So he was in the hospital 23 days. And so I was, for lack of a better word, devastated because I could see him coming out. I just felt like we were on the uphill and we literally were just on a roller coaster and went down. I felt like to me, it felt like, golly, I want to say like 5 minutes. And I know it wasn't 5 minutes, but that's how it felt. It just felt like it was just so drastic from being better to worse in no time flat.
Before we jump into the conversation about these devastating losses for our community and for your families, I just want to take a moment to appreciate all three of you sharing your stories, and also just to say that their lives mattered, in that the work that you all are doing and sharing their stories is not only having an incredible impact for others, but people need to hear these stories. So it's such a way to honor their memory and do right by them. So James and Terrence and Martin, you are missed. And man, you have left behind incredible partners who are doing really important work. Pamela, I know you have joined the call before. You were with us on November 25th of last year. I'm curious to say, since then, what are some of the issues that you are seeing widows in your group facing that are not getting the attention that they need, quite frankly?
I feel like one of the largest things is so many of them have lost their homes. And I feel like that's just devastating because their kids have not only lost their parent, they've now lost like the house with all the memories that they shared with their parent. And it's like the only house they knew. I think that's one of the really big ones, like figuring out how to survive without your spouse.
And what happens once a family loses their homes? Is there any assistance? Are there any government programs, or is this just resulting in these families needing to lean into their, whatever community support they might have?
Yeah, and or downsize to something that they can afford. I know a lot of widows have done that, or move to a different state because it's cheaper to live. I feel like the assistance that most of us get is with having GoFundMe pages or other, crowdfunding type of pages. That's probably the most assistance we have probably gotten. And it shouldn't be that way, that we rely on, people who know us to, donate a few dollars so we can, survive without our spouse. And, depending on who you know and where you live, your GoFundMes are successful or not, or who shares your story. So I feel like the people who really need it are not getting it.
That really resonates with me, not only from what I anticipate my journey would have been had my dad passed when I was a teenager, but also within the Marked by COVID community, I've known multiple widows who have had to move to different states because of cost of living or move in with family members. And it feels to me that there really is no acknowledgement that the families left behind are financially struggling due to the fact that they lost a breadwinner.
Yes, exactly.
Jerry and Ebony, I'd love to pull you into this. Loss of income, loss of homes is a huge issue facing your community. Are there other issues that really, spring to the top of mind that you all have seen with your community, or even with, in your own family, that isn't being, really addressed right now?
I really think, one of the biggest things is my kids. Like, I just worry about, there is so much, like, I teach in the primary grades. I taught second grade for the past 5 years until this year I've moved to third grade. But, I remember looking at my classes before, and the kids who statistically struggle or, don't really care about school or things like that, or get in trouble, are the kids who don't come from a two-parent household, or, and both of my kids, like Tyler's graduated now to school, but both of my girls, they loved school, good students. And now I see it's crazy. And from last fall to this fall, they've become one of those statistics. And I have them both in therapy, but at this point, therapy is getting to the point where I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be able to afford it. Because it's getting kind of outrageous every other week. I think before our insurance year, fiscal year started over, it was okay because we had so many deductibles, where James had over $1 million in medical bills. So our deductibles and copays were met. That it's really just started here in the past 2 months or so with me getting the actual bills for the therapy. And while I know that they drastically need it, I don't want to sacrifice other areas to pay for their therapy.
They also need to live in a house and have food to eat, and
and
gas in your car to be able to go to work. Those are real needs.
We had a really big house. This was our third house that James and I had bought together. It's actually a 3-story house. It was our dream home, going to be our forever home. And I remember in the first few weeks, so many people were like, "Are you going to stay in that house? Are you going to stay in your house?" And I've said from the beginning that I'll kind of do whatever I have to do if I have to work a second job or a third job, because my kids' memories with their dad are here. Like, if we leave, and Julia, my 12-year-old, heard somebody one day ask, and she was like, "Do we have to move?" And it got her really upset because she doesn't want to leave this house where her dad lived. So, my heart goes out to the ones that are having to. But, like, we've tried to cut back in other areas just because I did go. I did go from a 2-income house and like the day he passed away, I didn't get any more money from the Marine Corps, which he was getting a disability retirement, and my children got a disability retirement. But once he died, that no longer continues for my girls, which I still don't make sense of. But that was a huge chunk of income that's gone.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we've just tried. My main focus has been to try to make sure that I do keep the house, just because my girls' memories are here.
And that makes me, think a little bit too about, I know all three of you are educators and in the school system. Oh, we just lost Ebony. I was going to ask her a question. So I'll pivot to Pamela and we'll bring her in when she comes back. I know she's in transport right now. The impact of this pandemic on, school-age children. What are schools equipped to handle this type of grief? What sort of support have you received / are you seeing schools receive, and what more needs to be done?
In my county, in my county, last year when it happened, the staff of both of my girls' schools were very supportive, kind of realized what they were going through and tried to be there for them and kind of go lenient on if assignments weren't turned in or on absences to go to therapy. But there aren't a lot of kids in our area there are no other kids that I can think of that are my kids' age who have lost a parent, like in our small community here. James was unfortunately kind of the poster child for our area to wake up like, hey, it's can be young people also. But I mean, we have social workers and stuff in school, and I think that, I mean, there would be assistance, but I think they're not per se that they're doing a bad job or anything. I just wish there were more resources, because the way we're going, it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. It's just a matter of time before it will affect someone else locally.
I think there's also like this influx of now kids being affected by the pandemic, but then there's all the kids who've already had services for other reasons. So I just think staffing is an issue too. Like there's not enough staff to address the needs now of kids. And I also feel like teachers need to be trained, because I just feel like there is no understand, like a lot of teachers, I mean, I understand because my child has gone through something, but teachers don't understand, like when there's a trauma, like kids relive that trauma. Like Elsie in developmental stages relives losing her dad, and because she has a deeper understanding. So she's a different person. Like she went back to what she was in April of 2020 a few weeks ago. And that's going to happen throughout her life as she hits those developmental stages, and she's going to be in school. And I want her teacher to be trained to understand that, or at least have some awareness that when she's acting not like herself, or her grades are bombing a few weeks or something, that it's not because she's doing it on purpose. There's a reason. And I feel like there's just like, I feel like a lot of people don't understand that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that so much. And Ebony, I know we lost you for a second, but I'd love to pull you back into the conversation. We were just sharing some of the issues facing your children that might not be getting enough attention from, local national media or from a policy perspective, and was wondering if there was anything you'd like to add into that. I think we might have lost her again. Well, Ebony, if your line clears up, feel free to jump back in. But I'm going to pivot to Pamela again. You raised a couple of really important issues from both, how do we keep families in their home and support families, to how, are we doing enough to really address the training support that educators and others need to be able to be with our children as they continue to grow and have to grow with this trauma of loss. And these are two issues that I have not, I'm aware of from interacting with the greater COVID community, but I can't say that I have seen anybody from a policy perspective or even really media stations reporting on this. Is that true from what you've been seeing?
Yeah, I feel like this is stuff that's so important, but not talked about enough. And that's why I try to go to Twitter a lot of the times. Like anytime I see something with Elsie and I know about it because I'm living it, I want to share it, because I think there is this idea that these kids are okay, or it's not affecting them in such a traumatic, impactful way, but it is. And I want people to understand what it's like, because I feel like it isn't being talked about.
Yeah. I feel like, with all the talk about the anti-masks and stuff, I've noticed that those conversations, people seem to joke about it constantly and treat COVID like it is a joke or it is a hoax. And then my kids have to hear that when to my children, it's very real. It's very real to us, and it always will be. Not only did they lose dad, they lost granny within a 6-week span. And, when people are talking about how masks don't work and this and that, I don't want them to hear those conversations, and I try to shield them from it, protect them from it, because I don't want them to ever feel like we lost their dad or their granny and that it didn't matter. That they're not just a number, or they're not a part of some government conspiracy, that, COVID was real. But these people that have these conversations, that's been my biggest fear, is that my kids will hear this other stuff, like, no matter how much I pour into their mental health with therapy or, positive support systems, they're still going to run into people who they have to hear that stuff from. And it's just something I've tried to avoid and pray that they don't run into.
I'm really glad that you raised that up, Jerry, because it actually reminds me of some of my thinking shortly after I lost my dad, and how so many people, kind of came out of the woodwork to say, well, did he have pre-existing conditions? Like what was the reason why he died? Are you all of this kind of questioning, and like, are you sure he really even had COVID? And, as I was going through the beginning stages of my grief process, I kept on thinking about being a child myself. And, I did really well in school, and I loved school and I loved learning, but I could not remember being taught about the 1918 flu, or really any other public health crises. And I started to think about, like, what about that stigma that, people will be carrying if we don't actually daylight that this was real, that it had profound impacts, and that we need to, address that. And it's actually a big reason why Marked by COVID has been advocating for a permanent COVID Memorial Day, not only so that we can have space and time to honor the memory of those who have been lost, and those who have been on the front lines, but also to be a tool for us to really put a line in the sand to say, no, this was real and it had profound impacts, so that kids can actually have space to sort of grapple with the complexities of what it means to be a child who lived through COVID, who lost a parent to COVID. And so I want to bring you all in on that, about, what would, permanent COVID Memorial Day mean to your families?
A permanent Memorial Day would mean the ton to us, like James was a veteran. So like Veterans Day, was a big day in our house. Like if there was a day that was set aside to honor them, and then even if there was a memorial somewhere that my kids could go and see that, hey, there's my dad's name, or this is the COVID memorial, just stuff like that. I want my kids to know for years to come. It's not like they're getting over this. They have to live with it. I think it would be huge. Especially for us or anyone that's lost somebody to it. And I hope it eventually happens.
Yeah, it will definitely help in the healing process too, because it validates the fact that it did happen. It validates the loss that our children have suffered, and us too. But I really feel it's like crucial for the children. And, as a teacher, every time there's a holiday, there's always the day before, or the Friday before, the Monday off, you teach about it. You teach your students why we celebrate that holiday or why we have that day off. So I feel like if there was a permanent COVID Memorial Day, teachers can talk about, the COVID pandemic and what happened and why it happened. And then our children can be part of the discussion because they will have that personal experience that they did lose someone to it, and they can share. And I feel like in sharing, that helps you heal.
Right.
And their classmates can respect them and, understand a little bit more of what their friend went through or has gone through.
Ebony, I think we have you back. Can you hear us? Oh, I don't think we actually have Ebony back. I'd love to bring you back into this conversation, but we'll keep on trucking along. And I thank you both for, your comments on just what sort of that day and time can mean. And I absolutely agree with you, Pamela. The things that I do remember from, my elementary school education was I always looked forward to Black History Month. And it was an opportunity that we got to learn about some really incredible people and some incredible people that, I didn't know many. There weren't many Black children in my neighborhood. And so we had a couple of girls in my class who were, African-American. And it was so cool to learn about their experience and some of the visionary leaders from their community. And that was a really important way for me to understand sort of the unique struggles for that community, but also, kind of instilled in me a curiosity towards racial justice and sort of larger systems at play. And so when I think about that, sort of being able to have Elsie be part of that conversation, it really will generate empathy for the children, around her, to, see that story in the context of, we have an entire holiday for this. And I think it's a way for Elsie to feel really validated, but also really proud about, her dad and the sacrifice that, he gave in order to be on the front lines. I'm wondering from both of you, if you had 5 minutes with President Biden, I'm wondering what you'd like to say to him.
I'll let Pam go first.
I feel like when he was elected, I was very hopeful that more would be done for the COVID loss community. I feel like there are things he's done to help the pandemic move in the right direction, but I feel like those who have lost their lives and the people who have lost someone they love are still being left behind and not acknowledged. And especially for me, my husband was a healthcare worker. He was on the front lines. He is a true hero to this pandemic. I would like for him to acknowledge that my husband, did an amazing job, and he's, and give him some sort of honor, like you do other, people who risk their lives and lose their lives. So for me, I feel like just don't forget about us, because my children are going to live a very long life without their papa, and he should still be here. And I can't let them ever feel like their papa's been forgotten, and Martin shouldn't be forgotten. So that's what I basically say to him. Don't forget about the families that are left behind.
Jerry?
Right. I'm kind of in the same position. I do feel like that we have been sort of forgotten. And even now, I'm only 8 months out. And I know that Pamela's about 8 months ahead of me, I guess. It does kind of feel like everyone just kind of went on and the country tried to move on, and we're still dealing with it, and we will forever be dealing with it. A friend told me the other night that we can't be fixed. We don't want to be fixed. We just need somebody to acknowledge how we're feeling. Like, when I get upset or if I'm having a bad day, it's not that I want somebody to fix me. I just want somebody to acknowledge what I've been through or where we've been. I got really upset, with the whole incentives to get the vaccine and things like that. I feel like all that money that was given to people as prizes and things to get them to get the shot should have went to those of us who lost our person before there even was a shot. Like, I know in West Virginia, the governor gives out, he gave out like $5 million, and he's given out trucks and cars and football tickets. And it's a little contest to get people to get vaccinated, but that money could have went to the lives of the widows or the families that have been left behind. I think the money could have been dispersed better.
I'm so happy that you brought up that issue, because I remember whenever I saw the different contests across the country starting to encourage people to vaccinate, my very first thing I remember saying is, well, what about the 53,000 children who lost a parent? Like, what about them? And, I myself am not a parent, but I feel I care about the children of this country. This is the future. And this is a country in which it should not depend on where you were born or what you look like or your zip code, or if your loved one, accidentally got caught up in this pandemic and passed, need to be determined. So I find this very personal, because I know that there is a KRISTIN out there that has now an uncertain future because they lost their parent, and somebody needs to be fighting for them. Ebony, do we have you back? Yes, we have you back.
Am I back?
I would love, yes. Yay, you're here. I was just going to the conversation around, any thoughts on, what you'd like to communicate to President Biden if you had 5 minutes with him?
Well, just the same sentiments. I think that mine, of course, is from an educator's standpoint. When I look at, just like what Pamela says, about her husband being a first responder, first line of defense, and same thing with Jerry's. I feel like educators, they were never considered first responders. I don't understand that. I still don't. I don't understand why we were not part of the first people to get vaccines. I don't understand that. And now we are. And so, to me, my husband was out there. He was working with kids, trying to make sure that they were educated, as we all were. And even in the midst of not understanding, I think that everyone needs to be honored. I will piggyback on Jerry in saying, the money that was given out for these vaccines. We have children, and we have lost so much that most certainly, I'm going to be honest with you, money can't make up for it, but it would certainly help, because financially we have been impacted. We're grasping, trying to make it mentally. We're grasping, trying to make it physically, emotionally. It is a lot. It is a big weight that we have to carry. And just some sort of support, some sort of acknowledgement, and not this, we've got to go back to normal statement. That statement is hurtful. And I don't understand a lot of different things, other than the fact of, if you don't have to go through it, you don't understand it. And I just wish that we had more services, so that way people are more empathetic, and that way they can be more sensitive with the things that they say. So that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you so much, Ebony. I don't want to keep you all too much longer, because I know that you got to jump back into being solo parents. But just sort of a final word, I'm curious, if kind of going back to these issues of resources, of grief counseling, what do you think needs to happen in the course of the next 6 months to get on track of really supporting children, in particular the children that are in your homes and in the community that you serve, to really start to get on track?
definitely grief counseling. And I feel like there needs to be something to make it less expensive, because it is really expensive to send your kids to therapy. And the sad thing is some people can't afford it, and that's why their kids can't get it. And there just needs to be something for these kids, because without it, they're not gonna, their lives are really gonna be impacted, and we need to support them. I see it. I mean, in my school district, there's 42 children that have lost a caregiver. So there's going to be a lot of emotions there. And I feel like before they can even learn, they need to deal with their trauma, their grief, because that's going to be a huge roadblock for them. And until it's addressed, they're going to fall further and further behind.
Right.
Well, on that note, we are going to wrap up this really interesting conversation about the impact of COVID on our children, in particular, kids who have lost a parent. I am today joined by Pamela Addison, Ebony James, and Jerry Vance, who are all part of the Facebook group COVID-19 Widow and Widowers, which was started by Pamela. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to spend this with us and our audience. And, on a personal note, I look forward to doing everything in my power and supporting you all in this really important work to ensure that our children are not forgotten, that our loved ones are not forgotten. And to the point that Ebony just made, that we stop joking around with this idea that, things are normal, because things aren't normal. And things will never be normal, especially for your children and your families. So thank you so much for being here today, and to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.